Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Penguin TV. This is your host, George Ephelis / Whiffy Penguin, and I am hosted by PureMTGO.com and sponsored by MTGOTraders.com. You guys, if you have any needs, you should check out their online site for some great deals. They also have a brick and mortar store if you play paper as well. So, with this out of the way, I would just like to say hello. It's been a while since I've done one of these. As many of you know, I had a bit of a crazy time at the Seattle Renton headquarters of Wizards of the Coast playing in the Community Cup Challenge 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or however long ago when you see these videos. And it was a blast. I've talked about it on a couple of different podcasts. I've talked about it on Yawgmoth Soap Opera. It was just great. But so, speaking of Yawgmoth Soap Opera, I unfortunately had to sit out episode 21. And this was an episode that Zach and Andy started talking about Red, and Magus of the Moon in particular. And it stems from a conversation we were having about the new Commander products, and most specifically Chaos Warp, which is one red and 2 colorless instant that puts a permanent on top of its owner's library. They shuffle their deck, flip over a card. If it's a permanent, it goes into play. If not, it sits on the library. So we were talking, and I was all gung-ho about it and how it could work. And they, at first, they kind of poo-pooed all over me. But then they talked about it again without me, and they seemed to like it. At any rate, I listened to the podcast, and then on some comments that I noticed and got into a little bit of a discussion with on another website's article was that there are no viable aggro decks in Classic. And this is just not true. Now, I mean, a deck like Zoo doesn't exist because the format is too fast. But a disruptive game plan with creatures does exist. And here's a version that I found from Vintage and tried to port over to Classic. And I'm going to go over it and then play some rounds. Usually I play the rounds before the deck tech, but because the Classic event did not fire, and I doubt that the one on Sunday will, I'm going to go ahead and record the deck tech first. So, I ported over this deck. It's called Christmas Beatings. It's based on a red-green Null Rod deck, but this one is just a little bit different because it eschews Null Rod for Chalice of the Void. And we'll get to why later. But it's red-green, and it is heavily metagamed to play against Oath of Druids, Workshops, and Gush decks. Now, Gush isn't very popular online, which means that I may have to tune it further and take out some of the Pyroblasts. But the deck that I ported over in question was a perfect port except for Black Lotus, which I just switched to Mana Crypton for. The only reason Black Lotus is in there is for turn 1 Magus of the Moons. So it was a perfect port. Unfortunately, Gorilla Shaman does not make much sense in a format without Moxes. So they got taken out, and I put in a couple of Goblin Welders, because we have no way to deal with Tinker, other than Chalice of the Void for 3 or a Pyroblast. And they have to sacrifice an artifact to get their Blightsteel Colossus in play, so Goblin Welder seems pretty good. I can just instantly shuffle their Welder back into their deck, as long as they don't have a Dragon's Breath. But let's get into the deck. We've got 5 Wastelands, or 4 in a Strip Mine, to complement our Magus of the Moons. We have a nearly perfect mana base with 4 Forests, 4 Mountains, 2 Tegas, and then 5 Fetch Lands. The games I played, when I was sitting at 19 lands in my deck, I had a little bit of a problem, so I cut a spell for the Misty Rainforest to make it 20 lands. And it works pretty well. I usually get the 2 or 3 lands that I need, on top of these 9 mana accelerants over here. So we can get around Wasteland really well. We can work under our own Magus of the Moon phenomenally well. But, so that's the mana base, and let's get into the spells. here we have our destruction package. 4 Nature's Claim, 2 Seal of Primordium, Krosan Grip, all hit Oath of Druids, which is a problem since our game plan is revolving around resolving Magus of the Moon and Tarmogoyf to win. So we have the 6-7 main deck removals for Oath of Druids, one of which can't be counterspelled in the Krosan Grip. For workshops, we've got these same 7 cards, plus 2 Ancient Grudges. That makes 9, 11 virtual copies, and Lightning Bolts to hit Lodestone Golems. So we have 13, and Goblin Welders. We have 15 virtual hate cards against workshops in round 1. Pyroblast comes in again, or is very effective against Oath of Druids, especially since our Nature's Claim costs 1 mana. We can profitably get into a counterspell war and counter their Force of Will. Pyroblast also does double duty on counterspelling or removing a Jace the Mind Sculptor, which Lightning Bolt also does as well. Lightning Bolt has a little bit of application outside of this, hitting things like Hermit Druid or your own creatures to remove Bridge from Below, but Dredge is a terrible matchup. And it's almost not worth sideboarding anything, because you have to sideboard so much to make it worthwhile. And it's a very small percentage of what people play. So Lightning Bolt, very useful. Lodestone Golems, Trigon Predators, or Quasali Pride Mages, Jaces, Tezzerets, all kinds of targets. Pyroblast, primarily Force of Will, Mana Drain, Jace the Mind Sculptor. If you happen to go up against a Gush deck, it would most likely be very good in the Gush mirror or the Gush matchup as well. We've got 4 Chalice of the Voids. Now, I know in the last deck tech that I did, I was advocating Null Rod, because it shut down everything. I'm not very worried about Metalworker, especially with 15 main deck cards and then more out of the sideboard. But what Chalice of the Void does do is stop Lotus Petal from just ruining your day. So you want to set Chalice of the Void at 0 every time to turn off Lotus Petal. If you, by chance, can get lucky enough to get up to 4 mana, then you set it at 2 and turn off Spears and Oath of Druids. You generally do not want to set it to 1 because we have 4, 8, 9, 10, 14 1-drops that we actually do want to resolve against the matchups that we would want to resolve Chalice of the Void for 1 on. He's really in here for 0. Now, if your hand is all 2 and 3 drop removal spells, then by all means run out that Chalice for 1. That way you can stop Soul Ring and Mana Vault from hitting the table, as well as Voltaic Key, and turning off almost every Tinker target with your 0 and your 1-drop Chalice of the Void. Besides having better impact against Null Rod, or than Null Rod, because we don't care about the more expensive spells, Chalice of the Void also does prevent Tinker from getting resolved too quickly against you. Turn 1, it's not the best against, or turn 1 on the draw, it is not the best card against Lotus Petals. But you can't always win the die roll, and sometimes they'll get there. Other times, they won't have a Lotus Petal, and you'll jam down a Chalice of the Void. And then you can slow down their Tinker to either get a Goblin Welder or a Pyroblast in your hand. Also, with all of these artifact removal spells, it might not be a bad idea to go Chalice of the Void for 0, Nature's Claim your Lotus Petal against something like Storm deck. You might not want to throw away a Nature's Claim against Oath of Druids just to blow up a Lotus Petal. But yeah, so we've got Goblin Welder, who I kind of like, but I really wish that we had Chaos Warp online. For anyone who doesn't know, Chaos Warp, as I said earlier, is the mono-red Vindicate instant that can either randomly screw you or just randomly be a blessing in disguise. For now, Goblin Welder is the only way for us to deal with a Blightsteel Colossus on the battlefield. We can't Nature's Claim or Seal of Primordium it. It's indestructible. But Goblin Welder can put it in the graveyard, which will then shuffle it back into the owner's deck. He has very little synergy within our own deck. I suppose that you could get a Mana Crypt out of your graveyard by removing a Chalice of the Void, or set a Chalice of the Void for 1 early and then remove it with Goblin Welder to like Lightning Bolt them or Pyroblast them. There are a couple of little applications, but primarily he is to stop Blightsteel Colossus. And when we get Chaos Warp, he will be gone from the deck, probably as well as the Krosan Grip, or possibly 1 Pyroblast. I would like to run 3 Chaos Warps, maybe even 4, I'm not sure. The card seems like it's going to be amazing. To do our heavy lifting, we've got Tarmogoyf, Magus of the Moon, and these 2/2 Spirit Guides. Tarmogoyf will be quick in a hurry. I usually attack with him as a 5/6, sometimes even a 6/7. And he's really just muscle. He's the worst card in the deck, but you can't play a beatdown deck without him. And unfortunately, he's $43 a pop, as well as Wasteland being $48 a pop. If these two cards together weren't $91, this deck would be so affordable. But they are $91 to get one of each, and it takes up almost 80% of the deck cost. But for a lot of Legacy players, they already have these 8 cards. And for, oh man, what, like $50 to $100, you can build this into a classic deck with your, Zoo deck. And you probably already have Tegas and Foothills. Pretty affordable deck to transfer over to classic with. And then we've got Magus of the Moon. This is the backbone of the deck. And with these guys here, I've cast some turn 1 Magus of the Moons against everything, and it's amazing. Even going turn 2 Magus of the Moon is not so bad. Turn 1, like Chalice of the Void for 0, and maybe a Goblin Welder, or a Nature's Claim or Pyroblast up, and then turn 2 Magus of the Moon, it's really good. Workshops can't deal with it at all. They need to already have a board presence before you resolve Magus of the Moon. If you resolve Magus of the Moon against a lopsided in your favor or even board position against Workshop decks, you should win 99% of the time. If you resolve Magus of the Moon and Chalice of the Void against an Oath of Druids deck with no colored mana sources but red, again, you should win 99% of the time. They are tougher, though, because they're blue decks and they have Force of Will. But having all of these Spirit Guides really helps with the acceleration. Other versions of Magus decks I played, I tried Dark Ritual, and they're just not the same. And on top of that, they're better than Lotus Petals because they don't interact poorly with my Chalice of the Void. And I don't have to pay a mana to get this online against a Workshop deck. Let's say they have a Sphere of Resistance on the table, and I have 2 lands. If I have 2 Spirit Guides in my hand, I can cast my Magus of the Moon. If I had 2 Lotus Petals, I would have to wait another turn. So that's another reason they're awesome. And in the late game, this deck does not have a lot of win conditions, let's say. It can stall the game out pretty fantastically with all of its removal. But you're pretty much relying on these 2 cards to get the job done. And late game, like turn 6 or 7, turn 10, turn 12, these Spirit Guides come down as 2/2s, and I mean, they're pretty much unblockable. This format doesn't do a lot of creature combat, which makes the Fish matchup tough. But again, this is also a tough matchup for Fish as well, because they're not rocking a deck built to beat creatures. They're rocking a deck built to beat the same decks I am. So let's go into the sideboard now. We've got a pair of Red Elemental Blasts to come in against Storm, or Tezzerator, or Oath of Druids, or Gush, any of the blue decks. We've got an Ancient Grudge, 2 more Krosan Grips, a full playset of Sylvok Replica. And yes, this card is sketchy. I agree. But it does blow up workshop targets. It blows up Oath of Druids, and it blows up Time Vault or Voltaic Key. This card does everything we need it to do except stop instants. We've got 2 Tormod's Crypts, almost as kind of like a meh. I guess I'll try and beat Dredge decks a little bit. In my testing, I was actually surprised at how close I am actually able to get to beating Dredge before they beat me. And that was with no sideboard hate at all. And now I have 2 Tormod's Crypts. Which should help immensely. Especially if I'm managing to make the games last like 7 or 8 turns before they kill me. And the main reason that they are killing me is Icarid or Bloodghast. I can remove their Bridge from Belows, and I can remove their Bazaar of Baghdad's pretty easily. But then they just beat me down with the Slow Dredge and Icarids. Because as many times as I blow up bridges, unless I get all 4, they're just going to they have eventuality on me. I have no evasion, and I've got no real reach to speak of. So that's why the Crypts are in there. I've got 3 Pyrokinesis against fish decks. In Vintage, they would be Null Rod decks. All of the aggro decks play Null Rod except for this one. And I guess a few others. But this is a notable exception. Pyrokinesis, I assume, is good in there. I assume it's also better than like something like Nature's Claim against Dredge to blow up some of their tokens or blow up one of my guys to get rid of their bridges. I haven't actually tested it. I was testing 2 Sword of Body and Minds because it gave me protection from fish, which seems pretty good. But I think I'd rather hedge my bets and play a card that's better against 2 different archetypes than one that's just purely good against one. So on paper, this deck should crush Oath of Druids, and it should crush workshop decks, be a favorite in blue control decks, absolutely get crushed against Dredge, maybe an underdog against Storm decks, and 50-50 against other fish decks. I feel like whoever draws their Tarmogoyf wins in the fish matchup. But Magus of the Moon is a huge monkey wrench. Even against Dredge, turn 1 on the play Magus of the Moon is almost an auto win. So that's the deck, and I'm going to play some pickup TP games against the members of the community, and I will see you for round 1.